Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, January 5th, 2023, and today we are going to be talking about the state of New Hampshire and Nikki Haley's striking new performance in a brand new poll from American Research Group, a group that has been polling the New Hampshire primary for over a decade now, and a polling group that seems to show that Nikki Haley is climbing to a very high point in the GOP primary and that Donald Trump is starting to fade off in terms of his dominating support that he had over the past couple of months in the state of New Hampshire. Now, I preface this video by saying that this is an individual poll, and the circumstances surrounding the reason why I'm making this video aren't solely rooted in this poll, but largely encouraged by it. I think that New Hampshire right now is at an important intersection where it is one of the few states where you have an open primary where a lot of independent voters do actually intend on voting in the GOP primary. Voters that have made a difference in past elections, which I will show you a little bit later down along the lines of this video, but also ones that sort of tell us that the New Hampshire GOP on its own is not traditional. The governor here, the Republican Sununu, has already endorsed Nikki Haley, and she's been spending a lot of time here, even recently, saying that that a victory here would correct the caucuses in reference to the state of Iowa. Now, Nikki Haley has come under fire in the state of Iowa for her comments around it, saying that in her rallies in New Hampshire to the voters there that they need to correct the decision being made by Iowa, which starts it all, essentially referring to the fact that Iowa is on track to vote for Donald Trump very heavily in the GOP caucus there, but New Hampshire is a little bit trickier. And so for a while now, Nikki Haley has been doing very well in the state of New Hampshire, very different than what we've seen across many other national polls and statewide polls. New Hampshire seems to be the one state where Nikki Haley does exceptionally well. What I mean by exceptionally well is that in contrast to where she is nationally. Now, news out of the Real Clear Politics, the Real Clear polling here, not only was Nikki Haley tied just 2 days ago in the national average, she has now surpassed Ron DeSantis. So DeSantis is now in third place nationwide for the first time in this entire election cycle. We'll talk about it a little bit later today and the implications of something like this and how it could really set Nikki Haley up for a future presidential bid. But of course, that's not the topic of this video. The point of me showing you this is that Nikki Haley isn't polling too hot nationally. Donald Trump is at an easy 63% with a 52-point advantage, and seemingly it would seem that this would translate to dominating victories across every single state. And while that is the case for maybe 46, 47 states, it just so happens to not be the case for the state of New Hampshire, which seems to like Nikki Haley a lot more than national Republicans do. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have seen a different type of Republican Party in New Hampshire historically and presently. Historically speaking, New Hampshire has sometimes voted with the right GOP nominee, but sometimes not. And never in Republican primary history has the eventual nominee that is a non-incumbent won both Iowa and New Hampshire. And Donald Trump is trying to break that record. But it's interesting, though, because New Hampshire is a state that, again, the GOP is very much ideologically aligned with conservatism, but not rooted in religion, which means they aren't in favor of traditional values in the same way the national GOP might. A big reason why Nikki Haley and some of her more moderate policies tend to perform better than in other states. For instance, the majority of GOP primary voters in New Hampshire are pro-choice, very different than where we are in the national map. The majority of GOP primary voters in New Hampshire are pro-LGBT, meaning they are in favor of gay marriage and the legalization of it nationwide. That is not the case with the majority of the GOP. The majority of the New Hampshire GOP is pro-freedom, freedom of speech, and against, generally speaking, book bans, critical race theory, a lot of things that, or attacks on critical race theory, they simply do not care. Live free or die is the phrase that very often is thrown around in the state of New Hampshire, but is taken quite literally by the voters that embody the GOP, the Democratic Party, the independent voting coalition in the state, and you start to see that prevalent in the GOP primary here. When Nikki Haley takes more moderate approaches around issues like Ukraine, moderate approaches around issues like abortion, that is when she starts to do well in this state. And that's why we are making this video today. Because as of right now, Nikki Haley is at 29% in statewide polling in a state where Donald Trump is just at 42%. It is a two-way race between Haley and Trump, and surprisingly enough, or maybe not now that Ron DeSantis is in third place nationwide, he is polling at a measly 6% across the state of New Hampshire. The interesting thing about this, sorry, I'm skipping words for some reason. The interesting thing about this is that Ron DeSantis right now is polling at one of the worst points ever in the state of New Hampshire, but you take a look back a year ago, he actually was doing quite well. In the first ever set of polls that were released out of the state of New Hampshire, we can actually see here, let's see how far we can get back. Donald Trump had pretty defining leads, right? He was winning by 21 points, yada, 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 winning, and he was doing quite well. But when you look back at actual polls that were taken prior to this year, like I said a year ago, you got to keep going. You have to keep searching because Ron DeSantis actually used to do quite well in previous polls. And I don't mean just, a little bit better than where he is now. He's at 6%, and maybe I'm saying, he was at 15, he was at 20, he was at 30. No. In some polls in 2022, especially following the 2022 midterms. A perfect example of this is the WPAI intelligence poll that was done in August of 2022, where DeSantis and Trump were tied. They were tied at this point in time. And so this was a bit of a warning sign for Trump. And around the time, the national average was a bit iffy, but DeSantis had yet to prove himself until the 2022 midterms when all the Trump candidates lost. All the DeSantis types won, and DeSantis himself won by 20 points across the state of Florida. And so he was ushered into Fox News coverage and mainstream Republican press and was propped up as this Titan Slayer who could take on Donald Trump. And in polls subsequent, leading into around the end of January of 2023, again, a year ago, Donald Trump was losing to DeSantis. The first poll following the midterms, DeSantis led by 15. Then he led by 1. Then he led by 12. But now, DeSantis is at 6 and Trump is at 42. But it tells us that New Hampshire wasn't always sold on Donald Trump the way the rest of the nation was. DeSantis never got nearly as close to winning over the national average the way he did in New Hampshire. And that's because New Hampshire residents, New Hampshire Republicans, are very, very different. But like I said, the independent voting bloc in the state of New Hampshire can make a difference. Straight from the New Hampshire Secretary of State website here, the question here is, can I vote in a primary if I am an undeclared voter? Now, for a bit of context, the majority of states do not allow undecided, undeclared, independent, whatever term you want to use, for voters that are not registered under either side of the aisle from voting in a primary, a partisan primary at that. But New Hampshire, like I said, is very different than many other states, and an undeclared voter may vote in a state primary or a presidential primary, and get this, only one primary is really competitive, and that is the GOP primary. And so independent voters are likely to make a major impact on this GOP primary, and that is especially prevalent in the polls that we see surrounding the most recent one from American Research Group that shows Nikki Haley at 33% in terms of primary vote share to 37%. And this is important too, because if you look at the breakdown, they provide us crosstabs here that show that amongst Republicans, Trump has an 11-point win. But amongst voters who are not registered Republicans, again, independents who can opt to vote in this GOP primary, as many are intending to, because many of them do not want Donald Trump to be the Republican nominee again, and including, undeclared voters that vote Democrat nearly the entire time, who just simply don't want to register because, honestly, if I was in New Hampshire, why would I register? Even if I was a partisan, it would be nice to vote in a primary that actually mattered versus one that didn't. And so you see here that Nikki Haley wins these undeclared voters by around 7 points. And so even though they aren't GOP primary voters, they are independent voters that can tell the rest of the party that independents are here to say that they want Haley and not Trump. Even though Republicans may want Trump, independent voters don't. And I don't think there's much merit in it in terms of how it would sway a, gun-totten Republican who's very, very strong in favor of Donald Trump. They aren't going to waver or move away from the Trump campaign simply because Nikki Haley's winning over independents. But there certainly are voters here that are looking at it from a lens of electability that might now have a reformed look at it. I just showed you data 2 days ago that showed that the majority of Americans, or the plurality of Americans, believe that Donald Trump was on track to win against Biden. Around 90% of Republicans also agree, but again, those circumstances can change very quickly, as American politics does. I don't think it will, though. I will caveat this and say that I do not believe that Nikki Haley is all of a sudden going to now win the nomination from this, but I do think even having a victory in the state of New Hampshire would be extremely beneficial for her in future presidential campaigns, which she undoubtedly will embark on, especially if she's chosen as VP or not. She's going to come up to this potentially as the second place candidate across the GOP primary. She's making a name for herself in New Hampshire, and she really could give the former president a run for his money because of these undecided voters. And if you think that undecided voters don't make an impact in elections, think twice. In 2016, Bernie Sanders defeated Hillary Clinton by an astounding 22 points across the state of New Hampshire. It was a major victory won after Hillary Clinton had just barely won the Iowa caucus by less than 1%. Fast forward to New Hampshire, and for a brief period of time, Bernie Sanders had surpassed the former First Lady, former Secretary of State, former Senator, very well-known frontrunner for the Democratic nomination, and it broke the news. It was a huge deal, and it set Bernie Sanders up for his future 2020 presidential election bid. Now, Nikki Haley is going to hope that she's more successful than Bernie Sanders was in his second time going around, but regardless, he made a name for himself. He was able to use and utilize the open primary system of New Hampshire to win this primary. And if you don't believe me, again, the data backs me up. Because guess who also polled this race? The last ever poll that showed that Bernie Sanders was going to win by double digits and was very, very accurate in 2016 was American Research Group. That showed us that over time, Bernie Sanders was winning over a lot of support from Hillary Clinton, but that support wasn't coming from Democrats. In the New Hampshire primary race here, they polled Democrats. Roughly 64% of the voting bloc, Clinton was tied with Bernie Sanders. Now, Trump, of course, has a lead over Nikki Haley, but this is one thing. Clinton and Sanders were tied amongst Democrats, roughly what was happening in Iowa when Democrats were the only ones who were allowed to vote. But then fast forward to the undeclared, or not fast forward, but shift over rather, to the undeclared independent voters. Guess what happens here? They back Bernie Sanders 60-35. And so when they turn out to vote, I'm sure Clinton did very well amongst the traditional establishment Democratic base, as she was widely expected to, and as she did very well in the superdelegate count in the states where they love establishment Democrats. They love Obama-era Democrats, South Carolina, the southern region, a number of states on Super Tuesday. Hillary Clinton did very well amongst those states, especially ones that barred independents from voting. But in states that did, you found that Bernie Sanders did well. So what relevance does this have to 2024? Well, it literally indicates exactly what's happening in the New Hampshire primary on the GOP side. The exact reason why Nikki Haley can even come up close to 33% to Donald Trump's 37%, because independent voters do make a difference in the GOP primary without a doubt, and will make a difference, and are the exact reason why the GOP nomination nationally is so different than the results in New Hampshire that we are about to see in about 2 to 3 weeks. Why this is so disconnected from the National Republican Party because of independent voters and the current state of the GOP in a state that simply does not believe in the same restrictions that the National Republican Party does. It also helps that, again, that governor, Sununu, who's very popular across the state and was one of the few Republicans who was able to outrun the Democrats in 2020 when you saw that Jeanne Shaheen was winning by 15, Biden was winning by 7. These were strong victories for a state that, historically has been decided by less than a point in numerous elections and used to be a Republican stronghold, right? And so Democrats ran across the margin, did very, very well, across the ballot, ran up their margins. Sununu said, absolutely not, I'm going to win. I'm a Republican that people adore and love, and he was right, and it's the same reason why that endorsement actually made an impact in this state. And so if this momentum continues, if she does well in Iowa, which she has already started to write off, so I'm not super hopeful on that end. If I was a Haley staffer, I'd be saying, oh, why are we doing that? But I think it's largely because she's beating DeSantis nationally, she's beating him in New Hampshire handedly, she's beating him in South Carolina, but she's losing to him in Iowa because a huge evangelical population that does not agree with her stance to step away from a national abortion ban, with her stance to step away from some of the more hardline conservative social values. I mean, even recently she came out and said that we shouldn't be calling, people who Republicans would say are illegal immigrants criminals, because that is dehumanizing and wrong. And that's a stance that I think many independent voters, of course, nearly every Democrat would agree with, but Republicans say absolutely not. But the Republicans in New Hampshire say yes. The ones in Iowa, though, probably very turned off, and in fact are turned off, as a lot of the data seems to suggest that her more moderate tone isn't winning over Iowa caucus goers. Again, why she's already starting to downplay the results of the caucus. But if she does better and surprises us in terms of her performance here, I could very well imagine that translating into momentum in New Hampshire, where maybe we could see an upset victory. I no longer think it's outside of the realm of possibility that Nikki Haley could win New Hampshire. Do I think it's likely? Absolutely not. But do I think it's possible? Yes, for the first time in months. I never really thought it would be Nikki Haley who could be able to come up this close in the state of New Hampshire. It was always DeSantis, and now that it's her, I'm starting to have a new view on how this result could go, especially with new data and and a consistent upward trend that isn't just benefited by an individual endorsement and all of a sudden a huge scandal breaks for Donald Trump. This consistent lead has been building since Sununu's endorsement, before Sununu's endorsement, and well after Sununu's endorsement, and there's a possibility that depending on how Iowa goes, the third place candidate here, not Ron DeSantis, Chris Christie, who's hovering in around 11% in terms of support, could endorse Nikki Haley. He's already very much commended her on the debate stage, and sure, he has his disagreements with her, but he is very against Donald Trump and says he will not vote for Donald Trump in 2024 if he is the nominee. And so you have that as something that he's going to go ahead on, potentially, on national television, whatever it might be, and to his supporters, if he does poorly in Iowa, could very well endorse Nikki Haley and prop her up in New Hampshire. Because you know what happens if you add Christie and Haley together? She's within 1 or 2 points of Donald Trump. And so that's a very good place to be as somebody who's running against a former president. Again, New Hampshire is unique. New Hampshire has independent voters that do not exist practically anywhere else in the national party in terms of having a say in the GOP primary. And so that's a very big issue that she is going to have to combat. But at the end of the day, if she can genuinely defeat President Donald Trump, it will be a huge break not only for this election, where I think it will continue to allow her to stay in this race and maintain a presence and build up more and more and more name recognition for herself, media clips, etc., but be a huge break for the 2028 election, where even her presence may pressure out other Republicans from deciding to run, because she is seen as so strong of a candidate that she could even take on the one Republican that everybody was saying could not be beat, and potentially she could be the one to do it. Re-upping my, standard view here, it's not likely, but for the first time in probably, honestly, 6, 7, 8 months now, it is possible. And continuing at this trend, Nikki Haley realistically could come within striking distance of Donald Trump. It's besides the fact that maybe we could see some major screw-ups, some major, disagreements within the national GOP party and where she is. But for right now, I think Nikki Haley is in a strong position, a position that could allow her to do very well in New Hampshire. And like I said, not only set herself up for this election, but for many more to come, which only time will tell. But in around 3 weeks, we will have our answer about the state of New Hampshire. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Republican primary analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.